We're just days away from reaching 1,000 subscribers. If we hit this goal in the next 15 days, we'll be able to keep the channel running and continue bringing you these stories. Your subscription makes all the difference. It's quick and helps us enormously. The Guardian's Courage. Chapter 1. The Iron Bride. The Wyoming Territory in 1882 was a harsh land that bred hard people. But none were as unyielding as Victoria Blackwood, the new mistress of the Circle M Ranch. The sprawling cattle empire stretched across 20,000 acres of prime grazing land, ruled by Thomas McKenna, a widowed cattle baron whose first wife had died giving birth to their twins 3 years prior. Sarah Jane Murphy had come west from Boston 6 months ago. Fleeing circumstances she preferred not to discuss with anyone on the ranch. At 23, she was a small woman with auburn hair and green eyes that missed very little, hired as housemaid and occasional caretaker for Mr. McKenna's 6-year-old twins, Luke and Lucy. What she had discovered in her time at the Circle M filled her with growing alarm. Thomas McKenna was a good man. Everyone in the territory knew that. Fair with his hands, honest in his dealings, and devastated by the loss of his beloved first wife, Mary. When he had married Victoria Blackwood 3 months ago, folks had been relieved that he'd found someone to help raise his children and manage the big house. Victoria came with impeccable references from back east, claiming experience in managing large households and caring for children. The reality, Sarah Jane quickly learned, was far different from Victoria's claims. On this particular autumn morning, Sarah Jane was cleaning the parlor when she heard Victoria's sharp voice echoing from the children's room upstairs. "Luke McKenna, you will stand in that corner until I tell you to move. And if I hear one word from you, you'll spend the rest of the day there." Sarah Jane set down her dustcloth and moved quietly to the bottom of the stairs. Thomas had left before dawn to check on the cattle in the northern pasture and wouldn't be back until evening, a fact Victoria seemed to time her worst behavior around. "But ma'am," came Luke's small voice, "I was just trying to help Lucy with her reading like Papa told us to." "Don't you dare talk back to me!" Victoria's voice cracked like a whip. "Children should be seen and not heard, and certainly not giving opinions about what they should or shouldn't do." Sarah Jane climbed the stairs as quietly as she could, her heart breaking at the sound of quiet sobbing that could only be coming from little Lucy. "And you, miss," Victoria continued, now addressing the little girl, "stop that snivelling this instant. Ladies don't cry over every little thing. Your father may coddle you, but I will not tolerate such weakness." Sarah Jane reached the top of the stairs and peered around the corner into the children's room. What she saw made her blood run cold. Luke stood rigidly in the corner, his small shoulders shaking with suppressed tears, while Lucy sat on her bed clutching a rag doll, trying desperately to muffle her sobs. Victoria stood in the center of the room like an avenging angel, her black dress and severe hairstyle making her look more like an undertaker than a mother figure. She was a tall, angular woman with cold grey eyes and a mouth that seemed designed for frowning. "Now," Victoria said in that clipped Eastern accent that sounded so out of place in Wyoming, "you will both remain here in complete silence until your father returns. Sarah Jane can bring you bread and water for supper. That's all children who misbehave deserve." "But, ma'am," Lucy whispered, "we didn't misbehave. Luke was just helping me with my letters, like Papa said." Victoria moved toward the little girl so quickly that Sarah Jane almost gasped aloud. "What did I just say about talking back?" She grabbed Lucy's chin roughly, forcing the child to look at her. "Perhaps a day without any food at all would teach you better manners." That was enough. Sarah Jane stepped into the room, her Irish temper finally overriding her caution. "Mrs. McKenna," she said, her voice steady despite the rage building inside her, "perhaps I could help the children with their lessons while you see to other household matters." Victoria spun around, her grey eyes flashing with annoyance at the interruption. "Sarah Jane, I don't recall asking for your opinion on how I handle these children." "No, ma'am," Sarah Jane replied carefully, "but Mr. McKenna did ask me to make sure the twins kept up with their reading and arithmetic while he was out on the range." It was partially true. Thomas had mentioned wanting his children to be well educated, unlike many ranch children who grew up barely able to read. Sarah Jane could see Victoria's mind working, calculating whether she could afford to openly contradict the boss's wishes. "Very well," Victoria said finally, "but these children need to learn discipline. They've been spoiled by their father's indulgence since their mother died." Sarah Jane bit her tongue to keep from saying what she really thought. Mary McKenna had been beloved throughout the territory, known for her kindness and gentle spirit. The idea that Thomas had spoiled his children with love after such a devastating loss struck Sarah Jane as not only natural, but admirable. "I understand. Ma'am," she said instead, "perhaps the children and I could work on their lessons in the kitchen while you rest." Victoria's eyes narrowed suspiciously, but she couldn't find fault with the suggestion. "See that they learn something useful," she said curtly, "and Sarah Jane, make sure they understand that their behavior today was unacceptable." After Victoria left, Sarah Jane quickly moved to the corner where Luke still stood facing the wall. She gently turned the little boy around, and her heart nearly broke at the sight of his tear-stained face, trying so hard to be brave. "Come here, sweetheart," she said softly, opening her arms. Luke hesitated for just a moment before rushing into her embrace, followed immediately by Lucy. Sarah Jane held both children close, feeling their small bodies trembling with the effort of containing their fear and confusion. "You're safe with me," she whispered into their hair, meaning every word with a fierce intensity that surprised her. "You're both safe with me." "Sarah Jane," Lucy whispered against her shoulder, "why does Mama Victoria hate us? What did we do wrong?" "You didn't do anything wrong, little love," Sarah Jane assured her, though her mind was racing with the implications of what she'd witnessed. "Sometimes grown-ups have troubles that make them forget how to be kind. It's not your fault." "When will Papa come home?" Luke asked, his voice muffled against her dress. "Soon," Sarah Jane promised, "and until he does, you stay close to me. Understand, both of you." As she held the frightened children, Sarah Jane made a decision that would change all their lives. She couldn't stand by and watch these innocent little ones be terrorized in their own home. Thomas McKenna deserved to know what kind of woman he had married, and these children deserved protection. The question was how to make him see Victoria's true nature without putting the twins in even more danger. But Sarah Jane Murphy hadn't survived the streets of Boston and the journey west to be intimidated by one cruel woman, no matter how respectable her references might be. She would find a way to protect Luke and Lucy, even if it cost her everything. Chapter 2. The Cruel Stepmother's Mask. The next few days passed in an uneasy tension that settled over the Circle M ranch like storm clouds gathering on the horizon. Thomas McKenna had returned from the northern pasture in good spirits, reporting that the cattle were fattening nicely for the winter market. Sarah Jane watched with a heavy heart as Victoria transformed herself in his presence, becoming the picture of loving domesticity whenever her husband was near. "There you are, my dear," Victoria would coo when Thomas entered the parlor, rising to greet him with what appeared to be genuine affection. "The children and I have been so looking forward to your return." Luke and Lucy would be summoned to display their lessons, standing stiffly beside Victoria's chair while she presented them like prize livestock at a county fair. "Show your father how well you've been practicing your penmanship," she would command with a smile that never reached her cold grey eyes. Sarah Jane noticed how the children's natural exuberance dimmed in Victoria's presence. how they measured each word before speaking, how they watched their stepmother's face for signs of the displeasure that would surely follow once their father was out of sight again. The breaking point came on a rainy Thursday morning when Thomas had ridden out to meet with a cattle buyer in town. Victoria had been particularly sharp with the children at breakfast, criticizing Lucy's posture and Luke's table manners until both twins sat frozen with anxiety. "Sarah Jane," Victoria commanded as she rose from the table, "take the children upstairs and see that they practice their letters. I don't want to hear a sound from them until dinner time." As they climbed the stairs, Sarah Jane heard Victoria muttering to herself in the parlour below. "Spoiled little brats. Think they can get away with anything because their precious father dotes on them. Well, they'll learn different while I'm in charge of this house." In the children's room, Sarah Jane settled Luke and Lucy at the small table by the window with their slates and chalk. She was just beginning to help Lucy form her letters when they heard the front door slam shut with unusual force. "Mrs. McKenna," called a voice from downstairs. "It's Doc Henderson. Is everything all right? I was riding by and thought I heard shouting." Sarah Jane's blood chilled. Doc Henderson was one of the most respected men in the territory, but more importantly, he had been Mary McKenna's close friend and had delivered the twins. If Victoria was cruel to the children in front of him... "Doctor?" They heard Victoria's voice, suddenly honey-sweet. What a pleasant surprise. "I'm afraid you must have heard me calling to one of the hands about moving some furniture. Won't you come in for coffee?" Sarah Jane crept to the top of the stairs with the children beside her, straining to hear the conversation below. "Actually, Mrs. McKenna, I came to check on Luke and Lucy," Doc Henderson said, his voice carrying the authority of someone accustomed to being obeyed. "I promised their mother before she died that I'd keep an eye on them, and I like to visit regularly." There was a pause, and Sarah Jane could practically feel Victoria's displeasure radiating up through the floorboards. "Of course," Victoria said finally, "though I should mention that the children have been quite difficult lately. They seem to resent my authority and constantly test boundaries. I'm afraid Thomas has been too lenient with them since Mary's passing." Sarah Jane's hands clenched into fists. The lies came so smoothly, so convincingly, that she could almost believe them herself if she hadn't witnessed the truth. "Is that so?" Doc Henderson's voice carried a note of skepticism that gave Sarah Jane hope. "Well, let's have a look at them, shall we? Children often act out when they're struggling with loss or change." "Children," Victoria called sharply, "come down here at once." Sarah Jane quickly smoothed the twins' hair and whispered, "Remember what I told you. You're good children, and you haven't done anything wrong." As they descended the stairs, Sarah Jane saw Doc Henderson's keen eyes taking in everything. The children's frightened postures, their reluctance to approach Victoria, the way they instinctively moved closer to Sarah Jane instead. "Luke, Lucy," the doctor said warmly, kneeling to their level. "How are you two getting along? I hear you're learning to read real well." "Yes, sir," Luke replied quietly, his eyes darting to Victoria as if seeking permission to speak. Doc Henderson's eyebrows rose slightly at this unnatural deference. "And how are you feeling about having a new mama?" Lucy opened her mouth to speak, then closed it again, looking fearfully at Victoria. Sarah Jane's heart ached at seeing the normally chatty little girl rendered silent by fear. "They're adjusting," Victoria said smoothly, placing what looked like an affectionate hand on Lucy's shoulder. Sarah Jane noticed how the little girl tensed at the contact. It takes time for children to accept a new authority figure, especially when they've been allowed to run wild. Doc Henderson murmured, his experienced eyes missing nothing. "Sarah Jane, how are you finding life at the Circle M?" Sarah Jane felt Victoria's sharp gaze on her and chose her words carefully. "The children are wonderful to work with, Doctor. Very bright and eager to learn. And well-behaved. And the best-behaved children I've ever had the pleasure to know," Sarah Jane said firmly, meeting Victoria's glare with steady green eyes. Doc Henderson stood slowly, his examination of the family dynamic complete. "Well, Mrs. McKenna, they certainly seem like fine children to me. I knew their mother well, and they have her gentle nature." "Perhaps too gentle for their own good," Victoria replied with a thin smile. "This territory requires strong character. I intend to ensure they develop it." After Doc Henderson left, Victoria's mask dropped completely. Her face twisted with rage as she advanced on the twins, who instinctively backed toward Sarah Jane. "How dare you embarrass me in front of that meddling old fool?" she hissed. "Standing there like frightened rabbits, making me look like some kind of monster." "Mrs. McKenna?" Sarah Jane started, but Victoria whirled on her. "And you, contradicting me in front of a guest. Who do you think you are?" Before Sarah Jane could respond, they heard hoofbeats in the yard and Thomas's voice calling out a greeting to one of the ranch hands. Victoria's expression changed instantly, the mask of sweetness sliding back into place so quickly it was almost frightening. "Thomas is home early," she said with a bright smile, as if the previous moments hadn't happened. "Children, go wash your faces and hands for dinner. Sarah Jane, please set an extra place. I'm sure my husband will be hungry." As Victoria glided toward the door to greet her husband, Sarah Jane gathered the trembling children in her arms. "You're safe with me," she whispered again, but this time the words carried an edge of steel. "I promise you, this is going to change. Your papa is going to know the truth, and you're going to be safe." What Sarah Jane didn't know was that Thomas McKenna had already begun to have his own doubts about his new wife, and that very soon he would witness Victoria's cruelty firsthand, setting in motion events that would change all their lives forever. Chapter 3. The Baron's Awakening. Thomas McKenna had built his cattle empire through careful observation and quick thinking, qualities that had kept him alive through Indian raids, cattle rustlers, and the harsh Wyoming winters. It was those same instincts that had begun to whisper warnings about his new wife, warnings he had tried to dismiss as grief for his beloved Mary making him overly suspicious. But as October settled over the Circle M with its crisp mornings and golden afternoons, Thomas found himself watching more closely, listening more carefully, and liking what he discovered less and less. The change in his children troubled him most. Luke and Lucy had always been bright, spirited youngsters who chattered constantly about their adventures, their lessons, and their endless questions about the world around them. Since Victoria's arrival, they had become subdued, careful, speaking only when spoken to and watching every adult's face for signs of displeasure. "Just giving them structure," Victoria had explained when he mentioned their quieter behavior. "Children need firm boundaries, Thomas. Mary was wonderful, but she did tend to indulge them." Thomas had accepted this explanation at first, remembering his own strict upbringing back in Missouri. But as the weeks passed, he began to notice things that didn't sit right with him. The way his children flinched when Victoria moved too quickly near them. How they ate their meals in complete silence, as if speaking might bring punishment. The fact that they clung to Sarah Jane Murphy whenever she was present, seeking comfort they no longer found elsewhere in their own home. It was Sarah Jane's presence that had begun to give Thomas hope. The young Irish woman had a gift with the twins that reminded him painfully of Mary's natural warmth. Under her gentle care, Luke and Lucy still showed glimpses of their old selves, laughing during their lessons, asking questions about Boston and the world beyond the ranch, gradually learning to trust again. The revelation that would change everything came on a cold morning in late October, when Thomas had planned to ride out early to check on the winter feed stores. A lame horse had delayed his departure by several hours, and he was in the barn consulting with his foreman when Sarah Jane's voice carried across the yard. "Luke, Lucy, come away from there right now." Thomas looked up to see his children running across the yard toward the barn, their faces streaked with tears. Behind them, moving with purposeful strides, came Victoria, her face twisted with an anger he had never seen before. "Don't you run from me, you little ingrates!" Victoria shouted, her cultured Eastern accent slipping to reveal something harder underneath. "Get back here this instant!" Thomas stepped out of the barn, his foreman beside him, both men shocked by the scene unfolding before them. "Victoria," Thomas called, "what's going on?" His wife stopped abruptly, her face cycling through emotions as she realized she had an audience. But the mask of gentility that usually slid so easily into place seemed to be slipping. "The children have been impossibly disobedient," she said, her voice shaking with barely controlled rage. "I found them playing in the mud like common farm children, ruining their good clothes. When I corrected them, they had the audacity to run away from me." Thomas looked at his children, huddled now behind Sarah Jane's protective presence near the barn door. Their good clothes were indeed muddy, but only in the way children's clothes got muddy from normal play, nothing that couldn't be fixed with washing. "They were just playing, Victoria," Thomas said carefully. "Children get dirty when they play." "Playing?" Victoria's voice rose to near shrillness. "They were rolling in filth like animals, and when I told them to come inside for a proper washing and change of clothes, they defied me. They need to learn respect, Thomas, and if you won't teach them, I will." "Mrs. McKenna," Sarah Jane spoke up, her Irish accent thick with emotion, "the children were just playing by the creek. When you called them, they were coming right away." "Don't you dare contradict me," Victoria whirled on the young woman. "You encouraged their wild behavior, filling their heads with stories and nonsense, instead of teaching them proper deportment." Thomas felt something cold and hard settling in his chest as he watched his wife's face contort with genuine hatred toward both his children and the woman who cared for them. This was not the loving, refined lady who had charmed him during their brief courtship. "Victoria," he said quietly, "that's enough." "Enough?" She turned that fury on him now, and Thomas saw his foreman take a step backward. "Thomas, these children are out of control. They need discipline, real discipline, not the coddling they've received since Mary died." The mention of his first wife in that tone was like a match to dry kindling. "Don't," Thomas said, his voice carrying the kind of quiet menace that made hardened cowboys step carefully around him. "Don't you ever speak of Mary that way." Something in his tone must have penetrated Victoria's rage, because she suddenly seemed to realize how far she had gone. Her face went pale, and she tried to summon her usual composed demeanor. "Thomas, I'm sorry. The children they frustrate me so. I'm only trying to help them become proper young people." But Thomas was looking past his wife now, seeing his children clearly for the first time in months. Luke's face bore the pale, pinched look of a child living in constant fear of punishment. Lucy's bright spirit had dimmed to a flickering ember of its former self. And Sarah Jane. Sarah Jane was looking at him with an expression that held both desperate hope and terrible knowledge, as if she had been waiting for this moment while dreading what it might cost. "Children," Thomas said gently, "come here." Luke and Lucy approached hesitantly, still staying close to Sarah Jane's side. When they were near enough, Thomas knelt down to their level, studying their faces with the careful attention he usually reserved for reading the weather or tracking predators. "Tell me the truth," he said softly. "Are you happy?" The simple question seemed to break something inside both children. Lucy's face crumpled, and she threw herself into her father's arms. Luke followed, his 6-year-old composure finally cracking as sobs shook his small frame. "We try to be good, Papa," Lucy cried against his shoulder. "We try so hard, but it's never enough. She says we're bad children, that we make you ashamed." "We miss Mama," Luke added, his voice muffled. "And when Mama Victoria gets mad, she says we're the reason our real Mama went away." Thomas felt something murderous rise in his chest. He gathered his children closer, his eyes finding Victoria over their heads. The woman who had promised to love and care for his children was standing frozen, realizing that her carefully constructed facade had finally crumbled completely. "Sarah Jane," Thomas said without taking his eyes off his wife, "please take the children inside and see that they're comfortable. Get them some hot chocolate and cookies." "Yes, sir," Sarah Jane replied, her voice thick with relief and gratitude. As the three of them disappeared into the house, Thomas stood slowly, his full attention focused on the woman he had married in good faith and growing desperation for his children's welfare. "We need to talk," he said simply. "Now." Victoria tried one last time to summon her charm. "Thomas, darling, I know this looks bad, but you have to understand how difficult it's been." "No," Thomas cut her off, his voice flat and final. "You need to understand something, Victoria. Those children are my world. They're all I have left of the best woman I ever knew, and they are innocent babies who lost their mother and needed love, not punishment." He stepped closer, and Victoria actually backed away from the look in his eyes. "What I just witnessed tells me everything I need to know about who you really are," Thomas continued. "And what I need to know now is how long this has been going on and what you're going to do to make it right." The conversation that followed would determine the fate of everyone at the Circle M ranch, and Thomas McKenna was prepared to do whatever it took to protect his children, even if it meant admitting he had made the worst mistake of his life in bringing this woman into their home. Chapter 4. The Reckoning. The confrontation in Thomas McKenna's study lasted 3 hours and ended with Victoria Blackwood McKenna packing her trunks while cursing the ungrateful savages she had tried so hard to civilize. The truth, once it began spilling out, had been even worse than Thomas had feared. Sarah Jane, summoned to give her account of the past months, had initially been reluctant to speak against her employer's wife, but when Thomas gently pressed her to tell the whole truth for his children's sake, the dam broke. Story after story poured out. The verbal abuse, the unreasonable punishments, the deliberate cruelty disguised as discipline, and the systematic crushing of 2 innocent spirits. "She locked Lucy in the root cellar for 2 hours because she laughed during dinner," Sarah Jane reported, her voice shaking with remembered anger. "And she made Luke stand facing the wall from breakfast until supper because he asked if he could write a letter to his grandmother." Thomas's jaw had tightened with each revelation, his hands clenching and unclenching as he fought to control his own rage. When Sarah Jane finished her account, he turned to Victoria with eyes like winter steel. "You have 1 hour to pack your belongings and get off my property," he said quietly. "If you're here when I come back from settling my children, I won't be responsible for what happens." Victoria had tried tears, then threats, then attempted seduction, all of which bounced off Thomas like arrows off armor. Her final gambit was to threaten legal action, claiming rights as his legal wife. "You can try," Thomas had replied with deadly calm, "but I have witnesses to child abuse, and Judge Morrison has children of his own. Test me, Victoria, and see how far your Eastern refinement gets you in a Wyoming courtroom." Now, as the sun set over the Circle M, Victoria's carriage was disappearing down the long drive toward town, where she would catch tomorrow's eastbound train. Thomas stood on the porch watching it go, feeling as if a great weight had lifted from his shoulders. Behind him, the front door opened softly. Sarah Jane emerged with Luke and Lucy on either side of her, the children's faces showing the first signs of real peace he had seen in months. "Is she really gone, Papa?" Lucy asked in a small voice. "She's really gone, sweetheart," Thomas assured her, lifting her into his arms. "And she's never coming back." "Are we in trouble?" Luke asked, still not quite able to believe that the nightmare was over. Trouble. Thomas knelt down to meet his son's eyes. Luke, you and your sister have been the bravest little soldiers I've ever seen. You're not in trouble, you're heroes. As the children's natural spirits began to emerge from months of suppression, Thomas found his attention drawn to the young woman who had protected them when he had failed to see the danger in his own home. "Sarah Jane," he said quietly as the children played on the porch steps, "I owe you more than I can ever repay." "You don't owe me anything, Mr. McKenna," she replied, watching Luke and Lucy with the fierce protectiveness that had become second nature. "I love those children like they were my own." "I noticed," Thomas said, with the first real smile he'd worn in months. "The question is, what do we do now?" Sarah Jane looked at him with surprise. "Sir, those children need someone who loves them, Sarah Jane. They need stability and security and someone they can trust completely." Thomas paused, weighing his words carefully. "They need a mother who will put their welfare above everything else." "Mr. McKenna, Sarah Jane began, then stopped, unsure what he was suggesting. "I'm not talking about another business arrangement like what I had with Victoria," Thomas said quickly. I'm talking about the possibility that maybe we could all take care of each other. You and me and the children, as a family." Sarah Jane stared at him, her green eyes wide with shock. Are you asking what I think you're asking?" "I'm asking if you think you could love a broken-down cattle rancher and two scared little children enough to make a life with us," Thomas said simply. "I'm asking if you'd consider marrying me, not for convenience or propriety, but because we all need each other." Sarah Jane looked at the children, then back at Thomas, her heart in her throat. "I've loved those babies since the day I arrived here, and you're a good man, Thomas McKenna, a man worth loving. Is that a yes?" Before Sarah Jane could answer, Lucy looked up from where she was playing with her brother. "Sarah Jane, are you going to be our real mama now?" The simple question, asked with such hope and trust, broke down Sarah Jane's last defenses. "If you want me to be, little love, if you and Luke both want me to be—" "We want it more than anything," Luke declared, jumping up to throw his arms around her waist. "Don't we, Lucy?" "More than anything in the whole world," Lucy agreed, joining the embrace. Thomas watched the three people who had become his entire world hold each other close, and felt his heart healing from wounds he hadn't even realized he carried. Mary would always be his first love, the mother of his children, but Sarah Jane was his second chance at happiness, and theirs too. 6 months later, the Circle M Ranch hosted its first real celebration in years, as Thomas McKenna married Sarah Jane Murphy in the parlor of their home, surrounded by friends and neighbors who had watched the young Irish woman transform a house of fear into a haven of love. Judge Morrison, who performed the ceremony, later remarked to his wife that he had never seen children as radiant with joy as Luke and Lucy McKenna were that day, standing beside their new mother with smiles bright enough to light up the whole territory. And in the years that followed, travelers passing through Wyoming would often comment on the laughter that seemed to echo constantly from the big house at the Circle M, and the way the McKenna children grew up strong and confident under the loving protection of a woman who had once promised them they would be safe with her, a promise she kept every day for the rest of their lives. The Irish maid who had risked everything to protect two frightened children had found something she had never dared dream of, a family, a home, and a love that would last forever under the endless Wyoming sky.